Tim Stroh, an architect with Springboard Preservation Studio in Colorado. This case study, Gold Camp Bakery from 2012, is a small two-story building located in the heart of Victor, Colorado. The case study, to get right to the point, is a project that benefited from using the alternative code compliance study found in Chapter 34 of the then 2003 IBC, to use as an unbiased platform and have conversations between the architect, owner, and building officials. The project started off a little bit rocky since the owner began the work without a permit. For context, the city of Victor sits at the west side of Pikes Peak Mountain at an elevation of 9,700 feet above sea level. For reference, the next largest city is Colorado Springs, about an hour drive from Victor and 20 miles as a crow flies, directly over the top of Pikes Peak Mountain. At the time of this project in 2012, the city of Victor was about 390 people. Today, it's at about 430 people. Victor, which was formed during the gold rush in Colorado, had 8,000 people living there in 1894. In 1899, they claimed anywhere between 12,000 and 18,000 people. It's also important to note for this case study that in 1899, there was a fire that pretty much wiped out downtown Victor. And they rebuilt the town within about 6 months of the fire, knowing that there was gold to be found. So following that gold rush, though, there was a slow decline of mining boom and bust cycles, along with many of the mine closures pre-World War II. And so really declined to the point of what we know now is the Main Street community of Victor. This building has two primary tenants. The first floor is commercial business, and the second floor is residential. Very little information was available prior to 2012, excuse me, when this project took place regarding previous tenants. Some information from the 1909 Sanborn maps was available. No other building or city permits really existed, though. And we were able to find some tax records of previous tenants in the building from 1990 to 2012, such as a gunsmith, hair salon, and a chamber of commerce. The building, being at the core of Victor downtown, was built following that fire of 1899 I discussed earlier. And it's constructed of brick masonry exterior walls, wood frame floor and wood frame roof, and the facade fronts on the city sidewalk, which has two entries to the commercial space and a middle entry going to a stair to the upper level residential space. There's an open lot to the north and an adjacent building to the south and a small parking area off the alleyway to the east. The building is also sited, as much of Victor is, on the side of a hill, with a slope on the sidewalk going in front of the building that exceeds the ADA 1 in 12 slope. Much of the sidewalk is actually over 212 pitch. The building totals over 3,500 square feet and is non-sprinklered. As noted earlier, it's been typically used for business on the main level and residential on the upper level. There was no other information saying otherwise, and very little information that could be documented. The scope of this project for the Gold Camp Bakery was to update the interior paint and finishes, update the electrical for kitchen equipment, and similar updates to plumbing or gas, and to move in, relocate their kitchen business or their cafe basically from another space in town where they were leasing. No interior partition changes, no structural changes, and there was no work on the second floor space being proposed. So at its core, a very simple tenant finish. The existing conditions are listed here on this slide, are a summary of the topics of what the building department was requiring of new owners to obtain a permit. At its core, the permit would require the owner to apply for a change of use, with note that a bakery equals an F1 or factory occupancy. Treated as a change of use, this would have required substantial upgrades to the building versus minor updates and finishes. Side note of interest, the building department being used by the city of Victor at this time was another building department located in a nearby jurisdiction about 30 to 40 minutes away, and served city of Victor under a memorandum of understanding to help with those services, which is not an uncommon thing to have happen with Victor being such a small community. By the time we'd become involved as the architect of record in the project, the owner had already begun work without a permit and had been issued a stop work order by the building inspector. I don't believe there was any ill-conceived notion by the owner that they were trying to avoid permitting. They were really focusing on opening a business as efficiently and on a pretty shoestring budget. When we had the initial conversation with the owner, they were pretty much thrown off about the stop work order. They thought some simple paint, chipboard, stucco repair, swap out a few electrical outlets, they'd be good to go. They just didn't know what they needed to get for a building permit. They didn't understand the process and basically just didn't understand why they were getting a stop work order. On the flip side, the building official, as part of the stop work order, provided a nice list of items to the owner that they were responsible to complete before requesting a permit. Let's see code topics on this slide. And, really daunting to someone who doesn't understand the code, and somewhat mundane, most of the requests, if you do this every day. While not part of the code study or design work, it's important to note at this point, there was a lot of misunderstandings and emotions during this time of the project, and we experienced a very unhappy building department, a very confused owner, and a city that was starting to get caught up in the middle of a local project politically. The community perception was the building department was being unfair to the project, basically a no-win situation for all parties involved. The building department felt that since there was no documentation of the building prior to this new tenant, it was a change of use regardless of the next use, even if it was the same occupancy as before. The city was asked to weigh in, but this is why they hired the building department. At this point, the building official had no drawings, no code study, no professional architectural and engineering documents, and a project and building owner that had started work and now in the middle of a business move and a torn up space, plus the added catch that the only other item the business had bakery in the title, and I believe this is how the F1 occupancy or factory occupancy was designated. It was literally the only information the building official had to work with. After about 2 months of back and forth with code studies, discussions with city officials, building official, inspectors, and the owner, including providing the building department the food menu, hours of business operation for the future use, we had made very little headway with making the case for an existing B occupancy in lieu of the factory designation. Until this project, I'd never completed an alternative compliance study. And as it turns out, ironically, the building official had never had anyone submit one. Creating the alternative compliance study and using a B occupancy as the basis of the study showed the property met or exceeded the fire safety, means of egress, and general safety components as it sat prior to permit. The building department was still hesitant from classifying the commercial space as a B occupancy or business occupancy. And after much more discussion and in order to get off the dead center of disagreement over occupancy, the building department agreed that by having an architect stamp liability, they would accept the alternative code compliance paperwork as part of the permit documents and establish the B classification. I believe this alternative study was technically a moot effort from the standpoint the project was never a change of use to begin with. The code study did provide an unbiased vehicle to figure out how to find compromise and somewhat leveled the conversation to resolve around actual issues and data versus perceived issues or emotions. The existing archaic horizontal separation between the existing business and residential was still an issue. The building department wanted the building to meet modern code versus accepting the historic horizontal assembly, but final compromise allowed an additional 5/8 inch type X sheetrock or gypsum board ceiling as a solution. We did add additional smoke alarms and exit signs, as would be common with tenant improvements. The existing restrooms could remain as they were. One bathroom was 6 inches too narrow to fully meet ADA guidelines, and the owner was required by the building department to request a variance from the city. The city council approved the variance as an ordinance, and it was a final step to complete the permitting process. The building department also asked that the owner hire licensed subcontractors. Those subcontractors were able to pull their own permits, which became a design build for the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, and allowed us as the architect to step aside and forego the expense of engineering to save some time, and then that was taken care of by the subcontractors. At the end of the process, the people, the project settled in a positive momentum to finish things up according to regulations and best practices. Plus, the building was much safer, improved from when the owners bought it. It cost the owner only those few months and some additional money for gypsum board and ADA component in the bathrooms, but overall, a short amount of time and expense considering where the conversation started. At this point in the project, there was an interesting ripple that I believed happened in the community following this project, and really a positive point in time regarding integrating codes into the city of Victor. Shortly after this project finished up and got their permit, there was a city ballot initiative that collected enough signatures to go to a vote to the city. This initiative was to do away with building code and no longer have a building department at all in the city of Victor proper. Basically, build whatever you want with some exception of whatever was required by the Colorado Building Code, which in this scenario would be pretty minimal. It did not pass, thankfully, but what it did do is create a pretty large community discussion. Over the next year, the city of Victor put together a building code committee for the purpose of analyzing a new local process, educating and creating amendments to the IBC that better reflected Victor. And then they found consultants to guide the discussions with city staff, local building owners, and general members of the community. The city during this year-long process recognized they had very few staff, but prioritized this as being important to the future of economic development and just general development of their buildings in downtown. So they did end up hiring consultants for the building inspection services and technical services needed, but kept the process of getting a permit within the city. Today, in 2022, 10 years almost to the day, Goldcamp Bakery is still open at this location and a very important business in Victor, Colorado. The food is amazing, so it's worth the trip if you're visiting the Pikes Peak region. Thank you.
My name is Joe Lonizak. I am the downtown design specialist with Wisconsin Main Street, and I'm also the co-chair of the APT task force that is looking at code issues on Main Street, and was kind of the impetus for this workshop. I am going to be talking about a building in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, which has been a Wisconsin Main Street community since 1990. Or 1989, I believe. And they have been a Great American Main Street Award winner, downtown destination winner. They've done a lot of great work. And in 2020, we got a call from a property owner who had two buildings that were adjacent to each other, and they were looking to renovate the upper floor. And we discovered that there were some oddities as far as code issues, and so we consulted with a historic preservation architect out of Sheboygan, Wisconsin, Jennifer Lurkey is out of Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and she works with Legacy Architecture. And we hired her to take a look at the this property because of the kind of odd code issues. We've had other projects that were a lot more complicated, but this one just had enough where it warranted having her take a look at it and help the property owner to navigate some of the issues. So taking a look at the building, as you can see, it is 2 buildings. Now, if you can see my cursor, this small 1-story building on the left, that houses one-of-a-kind interior design. They do retail as well as services, design services, but they are a retail business walk-in as well. And then to the left of that, in the center storefront, or the left side storefront of the 2-story building, is House Blend Lighting. Now, both of these businesses are owned by the same person, and there is a opening on the inside that connects the two. So, there's usually just one person working in there at a time. Now, on the right side of the 2-story building is Max's Bistro and Bar. Now, that is an assembly group called A2, so restaurants and things like that, taverns. So 1/3 of this whole ground floor is Max's, and then the other 2/3 is essentially one business, or it's 2 businesses, but essentially kind of the same thing. And that's a mercantile group M for those. And then on the upper level is an apartment, and it's actually owned by the owners of the building and the owners of the 2 businesses, the mercantile type businesses. So that's a residential group R3, which is buildings that have no more than 2 dwelling units. Some information on the building itself. It was built in 1889, and it is within the Bridge Street Historic District, which is their downtown commercial district. So that opens up a few possibilities that I'll explain later. The construction type is called VB. That's for kind of pretty common type of building on Main Street. It's unprotected, it's wood framed, doesn't have a lot of materials that provide the rating that a lot of new codes require. Building size, it's a pretty large building when you count both of the buildings together. It's 6,700 square feet, or a total of 87,000 cubic feet. There is no basement. So the ground floor takes up 2/3 of it, or a little over 2/3. Well, whatever, my math isn't great, but anyway, 4,085 for the ground floor. So that's divided between the 2 spaces, 1,282 for the A2, which is the 2 like interior design type businesses, and then 2,800 for the Max's Bistro Bar. And then the upper floor is about 2,600 square feet. And again, that's all the R3 type of use. Now, the scope of alteration is pretty minimal for this project, and it actually helped, which I'll explain in the next slides. But you can see the orange on this plan here, and that is really the areas that was slated for alteration. The rest of it was largely left intact. You can see from the photo here that there was some repair work that was going to be needed, but that's not really counted in the alteration if it's just repair. So of that, only 547 square feet of the 2,600 square feet of that second floor was going to be renovated. So that made it a level 2 alteration per IABC 504.1. Existing conditions. The building, the upper floor, the space that was going to be renovated was not accessible. It's a second floor unit built in late 1800s. Pretty typical that it is not accessible. There's a single staircase and exit. A lot of times these buildings will have one in front and one in back, but in this case, it only has the one in back. There is an existing door right here through this room that leads to that single story to the left. So this right here is the roof area of that single story. And then this is the entire second floor of the what I call the farm store building. The two properties at one point locally were combined into one parcel. So the same owner owns the same or both parcels, but they're actually combined into one tax parcel. Now that helps in this case. In some cases, we have larger buildings that fill an entire block where it's divided into different parcels. So it's the opposite of this, and that can actually create some issues. But in this case, it is one, and it kind of helps. The upper floor has always been residential, but it has been vacant for a while, and I'll explain how that affects this or doesn't affect it in the next slides. The plans show two windows right here on the right side of the building. It is my understanding that those are actually not there. I believe they're bricked in because, as you can see here, there's a building that butts right up to it. And this is kind of a stairwell and a concourse or atrium area for the building next door. So those windows are not there, but there are windows on this side and the door right here. Now, some of the code exceptions. Because the upper floor was always residential, even though it had been vacant for a long time, there was no change of use or change of occupancy that triggered anything. So that was a good thing. Some communities might have local zoning issues that if a building is vacant for a certain amount of time, then it triggers more extensive code issues. But in this case, that was not happening. Chippewa Falls does not have anything in place for that. So that was good. Because the building is a contributing building within the Bridge Street Historic District, it would be eligible for any of the exceptions that are available in IABC Chapter 12. So, maybe it's things like door widths or door swings, things like quarter transoms, if there were any, would be able to stay, simple things like that a lot of new construction would not be able to have. Per IEBC 1006.3.2 item 4, a single exit is allowed for this type of use, for an R3 type of building. So in this case, this one stair that is here is sufficient for this one apartment. Now, in this case, they are able to have a secondary exit, even though it's not required. They have a secondary exit out to a rescue platform. So it's not technically an exit, but people, if there were a fire, the occupants could get to this rescue platform. Now, if they do that, which I believe they plan to do, then they would have to have a guardrail around the perimeter. So again, this is not needed, but it would be allowable. Now, another thing that's really important on this wall right here, and this is this bullet point here, because this building is one parcel and not divided into two parcels, they are allowed to have these windows on this higher second floor. If this were two parcels, they would not be allowed to have these windows, because if there were a fire in this building, it could jump up and enter this building through here. But because they are one parcel, that is fine. Now, with that said, though, if they do have these windows, they would need opening control devices, and that's covered in ASTM F2090 and IEBC 702.4. Now, as far as accessibility, I talked about that before. For this type of building, there really isn't much as far as accessibility, but that really doesn't matter because accessibility is generally exempted. There are exceptions for it in existing buildings. That's covered in IEBC 1204.1 as well as in 1012.8. Now, one exception that is pretty unique in this case in Wisconsin, and as far as the building type and the scope of work and everything, relates to sprinklers. And that's usually the biggest issue in a lot of our communities is this: when sprinklers are required, it can raise the price of the renovation so much that it becomes infeasible. And then properties a lot of times tend to sit vacant on the upper floors because the property owners can't afford to do the work. But in this case, with this property, when it was reviewed by Jennifer in 2020, there was an exception to the case where, through a white paper done by the Department of Code Review, that's not the technical term, but I can't think of it right now. But anyway, the State Review Office, they had a white paper that kind of said that in cases, even if this project were doing more than 50%, that it may have been exempted. Now, that was in 2020. As of April 19th, 2021, the state legislature eliminated those exemptions. And it didn't apply to this project because they were only doing 20% of the area. But if it would have been 50%, they would have had to install sprinklers, but in this case, they didn't have to. So that is really the main story for this Chippewa Falls project. There were a lot of things that they didn't have to do because of the existing conditions and because of some exemptions that were in place at that time. But mostly the things that they didn't have to do occurred or were possible because they were only doing work on 20% of that upper level.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nicholas Van. I am the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer for Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, which in Washington is the SHPO. And I've also previously served as the State Historical Architect, which is how I encountered these great case studies that I'm going to be presenting on today. So the first one that I wanted to start with is the S.H. Kress and Company building in Wenatchee, Washington. And then later on, we'll also be looking at the Hamlet Hotel, which was historically known as the Cottage Hotel in Bellingham, Washington. I chose these two case studies for some very specific reasons that I wanted to touch upon right now. And that is namely that the upper floors had been either underutilized or vacant prior to their rehabilitations that were done within the past few years. And they encountered a number of building code issues with trying to create this new use on the upper floors of these buildings that had been previously vacant, or in the case of the Hamlet, actually used as housing historically, but had been vacated for about half a century. So just wanted to focus on those as housing types as we continue to encourage existing building owners to create housing in our upper floors, specifically in Main Street districts, so that we can invigorate our Main Street districts, but also find a way to work with the codes, building code officials, historic architects, et cetera, in order to make these projects function. So the first project we're looking at, the S.H. Kress and Company building in Wenatchee, Washington, was completed by Forte Architects, which is an architecture firm based in Wenatchee, Washington as well. Just some quick data that we'll show here. This is a really wonderful building, as you can see. It has original curved storefront, original tile and crest written into the entryway that you see there. And it also has an original awning hardware system. The awning has been replaced. It was replaced as part of the rehab recently, but it is still a functioning awning and is a very unique feature that is actually quite hard to come by nowadays on a building that of this age. So some pretty incredible features, and you can see the building itself is incredibly intact, exhibits a number of really great historic features that are significant and were wonderful to be able to be preserved by this project. So just some quick building data for you. Project architect, again, was Forte Architects out of Wenatchee, Washington. The upper floor was actually rehabbed twice. First time was in 2008. for apartments. About half of the upper floor was rehabbed for an owner suite. And in 2018, the other half was rehabbed, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. The first floor and the basement are currently being used for mercantile purposes. You can see there's a retail outlet in that space. And the second floor is now classified as an R3 occupancy. The construction class was 5B, and this is in fact an unreinforced masonry building as well, with wood framing inside. Building footprint's about 6,000 square foot. It's a 50 by 120 foot footprint over the 3 floors, 2 above grade, 1 including 3 including the basement. Total gross feet about 18,000 square feet. This is going to be notable later on when we talk about compliance paths. Some more data, background on this project. The code at this time was IEBC 2015, because the most recent rehab was completed in 2018, just before the newer version of IEBC had been adopted. And it was also subject to the Washington State Energy Code, WSEC 2015 version, which does give some leeway for existing and historic buildings, if you're not familiar with that code. The compliance path that was used under the existing building code was prescriptive, and this was a choice that the architects made in an effort to try to make things a little bit easier in terms of getting an occupancy permit and to actually permit the construction. However, there are some little nuances into why that compliance path might have been different, knowing what we know about this project and interactions with trying to get a permit and working with the building code officials in Wenatchee here. So some of the negotiated solutions that we saw with this particular project are that the retail space on the ground floor and basement remained fully occupied, and this presented some challenges with trying to retrofit some of the systems into the upper floor here. There was an insufficient fire separation determined by the building code official, and there were actually no legal bedrooms that could be implemented as part of this conversion. You also see that there are different code versions that were used from the 2008 to the 2018 apartment conversions, and also fire alarm system, sprinkler system, et cetera. Those were systems that were originally planned and then ultimately implemented as a result of this project. There was, in my opinion, a bit of a slight equivalency on the 2-hour separation between the retail space and the apartments upstairs. And we had to actually prove that the existing assembly had a particular fire rating that didn't quite meet the 2-hour fire separation required by code, but it was pretty close. I think we achieved about a 1 hour and 40-minute fire separation where there's a 2-hour separation required. So this is one of the first iterations of the original plan in 2018. You can see a couple of bedrooms in the middle of the space with no rescue openings. And you can also see a large living area incorporated with an open kitchen and dining room concept, along with a kind of front sunroom that separated that front elevation from the rest of the living space. Now, this was problematic from the building code perspective because the sleeping rooms don't have rescue openings and they weren't determined to be legal bedrooms, legal sleeping areas. And so the architect had to work with the owner and kind of come up with an alternate solution for how these spaces could be either reconfigured or redefined. And you can see in the ultimate solution, those back bedrooms are now classified as home office, TV room, and then you have your front area classified as a sleeping/living area in a studio apartment kind of setup. So that was what it took to get past the legal sleeping area requirements, but we still had the issue of fire sprinklers, fire alarm system, et cetera, which ultimately were installed. This shows the fire separation that was required by code as well as what was proposed here. So you can see the horizontal separation between the retail space on the first floor and the R3 occupancy class on the second floor was 2 hours required. The drawing that you see on the upper right there shows the existing flooring assembly. And again, the point was to try to minimize as many disruptions to the retail tenant as possible. And so there was no real proposal to alter any of the flooring assembly or the floor separation on either side, either on the first floor side or on the unit side either. And one of those reasons was also because the floor spans a non-load bearing wall that separates the two apartment units on the upper floor. And it would have been infeasible to go in and interrupt that tenant space as well to do anything on the second floor side. And so ultimately, the architects made the argument that, okay, we have about a 1 hour and 40-minute separation here with the existing assembly. How about if we implement all these other things that were required by code, fire alarm system and sprinkler system, but also utilize a 2 hour separation between the two units in lieu of the 1 hour that was required. And ultimately, this solution was accepted. I think there's a number of different ways that we could have gone about finding a code path that would increase the fire safety for the increase of hazardous use by virtue of including more sleeping units on the upper floor of this building. But this was ultimately the negotiated solution. And it didn't result in any loss of historic character defining features. It didn't result in a significantly expanded scope of work because they had already planned on installing a sprinkler system and a fire alarm system as well. And so ultimately the solution that ended up working through some of those negotiations was fairly prescriptive in the end. And this is some of the end result of the newly occupied unit completed in 2018. You see living area on the left there, sunroom at the top right, and a little bit of the corridors there on the bottom. Shifting gears, wanted to talk about our second case study from Washington State here. This is the Hamlet Hotel. It was historically known as the Cottage Hotel in Bellingham, Washington. And this was also a residential conversion of a space, of an upper floor space that had been vacant previously and now had 4 apartment units that were put into the upper floor. The project architect was Zervis Group, which is based out of Bellingham, Washington. And you can see a before picture there on the bottom right. And I note that you don't see any windows on the upper floor. That's because you'll see a picture later on, a historic photo later on, where we show kind of the signage that was done as part of this mid-century remodel, which resulted in the storefront alterations you see on the bottom floor there, but also in kind of stuccoing over and infilling the existing window openings on the upper floor. So just some quick facts about the Hamlet Hotel. Again, project architect was Zervis Group in Bellingham, Washington. This building was rehabilitated in 2017. And the first floor had a business occupancy type. And the second floor proposed was R2, which is notable because R2 is specifically for non-transient hotel use. And I'll get into that in a minute. Construction class was 5B. This building is also unreinforced masonry, which I'll note is different from the last case study that we covered because this particular building is west of the Cascade Mountain Range in Washington State. That's notable because the seismic forces that we have on the west side of the Cascades in Washington are far more significant than those found in Wenatchee on the east side of the Cascades. And so the seismic retrofit requirements for this building were a lot more stringent, but not something that was unable to be overcome as a result of this project. It was integrated into the project planning from the get-go, and there was a clear understanding of the minimal code required amount of effort that would be implemented to make this a safe building. The building footprint is quite a bit smaller than the other example that we saw. It's about 2,400 square feet. And this building is a modest 2-story building above grade, just under 5,000 square feet total. Because this building was rehabbed in 2017, it also used the International Existing Building Code 2015 version, as well as the Washington State Energy Code in 2015. It also used a prescriptive path of compliance, not performance or work area based. And then also the features that I wanted to point out were a result of the reason that wanted to point out that some of the features that were lost as a result of some of the plan changes were more because of a modernization of how we live in apartment units versus how they were done historically. So historically, this upper floor had 12 individual hotel rooms with shared bathrooms down the hall. And the vision for converting this upper floor into housing was to create 4 single bedroom apartment units. And so there was some spatial reconfigurations that resulted ultimately in some circulation changes. There's a number of code issues with this one, particularly with the seismic upgrades. There was a number of interventions that actually had to happen on the first floor as well as the second floor. And there was also, I'd say, an increase in the fire separation required on the upper floor as well. Another issue that was difficult because of the limited footprint of this building was the limitation of 4 units on the upper floor, as opposed to creating more units, maybe 6 or even 8 if you wanted to really stretch it, in order to avoid 2 separate means of egress. This project also incorporated from the get-go a fire alarm system, a sprinkler system, and of course the seismic retrofit. And then also with the Washington State Energy Code, an evaluation of the windows that had been left in place in lieu of repairing them, they were actually replaced to try to meet that energy code on a prescriptive basis. Another note based on the energy code requirements was that exterior wall insulation was not ultimately required because of some of the avenues within the energy code that allow you to not have that exterior wall insulation required as long as you're making improvements in other places, such as attic insulation. You can see some of the existing conditions here found in 2016 on a walkthrough. You can see on the left, there's a diamond end to some of the corridor. And this was the condition that the building was in. It had been used for storage for many, many decades since this mid-century modern renovation had happened. And because of that, a lot of the interior historic fabric had been actually lost. The circulation pattern was still relatively intact, but ultimately slightly altered as a result of this project. And you can see that bottom very large painted sign, which I think is pretty incredible. And you can also see the kind of neon signage above that. It was a product of its time, but not entirely practical to have windows that are stuccoed over if you're trying to put apartments and reinvigorate the use of this upper floor. But still a very cool photo to reflect on. Here you'll see a before and after of the upper floor housing arrangement. You can see a vestige of those diamond-shaped corridor ends around the middle of the core of the building on the left. And on the right, you can see the configuration that ultimately resulted from this project: 4 individual apartment units with a single bedroom. And again, the intent was to create apartment units out of this, but ultimately this has turned into a hotel. Here's another example showing a historic photo, as well as the more current photo before the rehabilitation. Some elevation showing how those window openings were going to be reopened and repaired. And then some structural plans that are difficult to read, but I'll explain. There was a shear wall that was proposed to strengthen that west wall there on the left side of the plan. This is showing first floor on the left and second floor on the right. There was a shear wall that was constructed with those window openings in order to create more lateral force resistance to seismic forces. This was one of the primary seismic strategies, but it was also something that went above and beyond the scope of just renovating and retrofitting the upper floor, because it did require a shear wall that went all the way down to foundation on the first floor. So it had some disruption to first floor tenants, but ultimately, a fairly minimal interruption considering all the things that had to happen in order to make this project successful seismically retrofit and be able to fully occupy the upper floor. I think it's also worth noting that the architects in their drawings were pointing out that this historically had a long-term residential use on the upper floor. But I think according to the building codes, it was technically vacant because it had actually been vacant for a number of decades. So part of a conversation, a larger conversation about what the actual features of an existing space are and what the uses were most recently, because there's no actual change in the features necessarily from that previous residential use to what ultimately ended up today, other than it had been used for storage and hadn't really been used for occupied sleeping areas for about half a century. Here you'll see some of the floor-to-wall connection details. This was the other half of the seismic retrofitting strategy. And pretty simple, in my opinion, in order to get this building its certificate of occupancy and a building permit, is a lot of these tie rods going through the existing unreinforced masonry, particularly at the floor connection between the first and second floor, but also at the parapet level to stabilize that parapet from falling down in an earthquake. Here's some photos of the finished result. You can see the photo on the left there with the restored window openings and some just really nice living spaces, stairway there leading down straight to the street level as well. And so with that, I wanted to thank you for listening to these case studies. It's really important, in my opinion, to find avenues for us to get building owners an easy way to be able to actually retrofit vacant or underutilized upper floor spaces. And we do this workshop simply because we want to remove a lot of those barriers to build a greater understanding amongst architects and building code officials, but also to identify some of the common issues that we find with a number of these types of projects, so that we can continue building housing on Main Street and reusing underutilized square footage in order to give these buildings a second life and keep their places relevant and significant. So I thank you all for joining us and hope you enjoy the rest of the workshop.
So the Tracy Lofts building was built in 1919 as a trackside warehouse. So produce was brought in on trains, delivered to the docks on the trackside, the opposite side of this building, of this side, front entrance, and then moved into refrigerated coolers and freezers. So as a result, this building, which is 3 levels, 2 stories above grade, 1 story half a level below grade, and it's a split level because of that trackside situation. So the main level is even with the loading dock on the trackside. That meant when you came in from the street side, you're going to go up half a level and you're going to go down half a level to get to the basement. That creates these accessibility issues. The space just wasn't going to accommodate an elevator in any way that made sense. But by doing 19 units instead of 20, we were able to, or just being fewer than 20, we did not become subject to the accessibility requirements of the building code. So that was a significant issue with this building, because just given the awkwardness of trying to put mechanical lifts in here and the space that it would have taken up, that would have rendered the building financially not viable. So the building is it's 3 floors, approximately 6,000 square feet per floor, total of 19 units. The upper floor units, there is one extra large unit upstairs. In the basement, there's one unit that's not a unit, that's a mechanical room. And the building was really in pretty good shape. It's a type 3B building, so it's load-bearing masonry on the exterior and heavy timber wood construction on the interior. But we did have some problems structurally inside the building. As you'll see when we get into one of the basement corner units, the floor in that particular corner, which had been inside a cooler, had actually completely rotted away. It hadn't collapsed yet, but it did shortly after we got started, and so we had to rebuild all that, which gave us an opportunity to create the higher ceiling in there. We're in the basement now, and this again was a trackside warehouse, and so what that meant is on this side there's a dock that was a train car floor level, which is about nominally 3.5 feet above grade, and it's up there. And so this was a pretty dark space with no light whatsoever. So what we did is came in here and built a window well and put a grating on top of it, which lets a ton of light in here. And so there were actually windows down here that had been underneath the original wooden dock. So we just enlarged those, dropped them down, dropped the sills down, and then cut holes in the top, as I mentioned, to create the window wells, and we've got all kinds of light that we didn't have before. So that was, it's just, how do we figure out how to make a basement unit work and not have it be a cave? So we look for opportunities. Also, where I'm standing right now, the ceiling's quite a bit higher than the rest of the space, and it's because this one corner of the building, the floor was rotten, structure was rotten, so we took it all out. And then on the unit above, the window sills were quite high, so we built a platform where the living area is, so that the windowsill relationship to the floor was more appropriate. And when we decided to do that, we thought, well, there's no point in rebuilding the original floor. We'll just build that up and over this, so it gave this space a nice high ceiling. So all of those are things that are just little tricks that we've run into. They're not really particularly code issues, but we were able to make some interesting spaces by taking advantage of the opportunities and the problems that we have to deal with as we go through here. The Tracy Lofts building, as noted earlier, it was a trackside warehouse, and so it was a block, and it had windows on two sides because it's also a mid-block building, and so we only had light and windows and air from two sides. The building's fairly deep, so one of the things that the codes that we had at that time, which was the 2009 IEBC, was that the requirement to have every bedroom have a window had changed if the building was sprinkled. So this building is fully sprinkled because that was really a critical thing that allowed this to happen even. If you see over here, the walls don't go all the way up to the ceiling. So we borrow light from the windows behind us. And so the bedrooms aren't dark, but they don't have direct access to light, and we don't have egress windows. And that was allowed because of the fact that the building is fully sprinkled. Another thing from an accessibility standpoint, being that this is a historic building, is that we could use provisions in the IEBC for historic buildings, and if we were fewer than 20 apartments, then we didn't have to have an adaptable apartment in A unit. And so we're 19. And that did lead to one kind of double unit, so we got one really big unit that's 2 bays wide. But that was another feature that we worked with, and by not having to do that accessibility, then this building probably wouldn't have been able to even happen. This is our lead environmental aspects for the Tracy Lofts, starting with our location. Site location is an important aspect of the LEED program. This particular site in downtown Billings has a walk score of 91, which just means that there are all kinds of available resources within easy walking distance of this location. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is we have no off-street parking. We aren't required in downtown to have off-street parking, and this site didn't allow for any because the building is a mid-block lot line building with tracks on the other side. So it was an experiment for us, but we've got 19 units here, and when we first opened, it was a big issue to me, so I made sure to explain to everybody who was interested in an apartment where parking was available, including on the street after 5. And but nowadays it's 10 years later and nobody even asks. So parking is not the real issue in a walking environment. A 91 walk score, you can walk to everything from here. Some people don't even own cars. I wouldn't say that necessarily that 100% of the tenants work downtown, but many of them do, and they really don't have to drive much. Next, water resourcefulness. So we do have the rainwater system, as I mentioned. We also have low flow fixtures, including very low flow toilet fixtures, which use rainwater. So we've been able to, with a combination of those kinds of features, reduce the energy or the water usage within this building by about 38% compared to typical for buildings of similar size and type. On the energy front, we do have, as I mentioned earlier, a 4 kilowatt solar array on the top that addresses the majority of the house loads. But we also have energy efficient fixtures, Energy Star appliances, that sort of thing throughout the building, so that our energy use is about 46% less than would be typical for a building of this size and type at that time. We diverted a significant percentage of the waste from the building from the landfill. As with the door downstairs, we found lots of things within the building that we could reuse. So we did that, but we also did manage, well, with that and other means, recycling included, we were able to divert 126 tons of waste from the landfill. So that's significant. And then all of these things together got us to a high performance building, and we are LEED Platinum, which is of course the highest level of certification. Okay, so now we're in the mechanical room, and there's a lot of LEED related things in this space. First of all, the systems are really pretty simple on the one hand. On the other hand, they're also different than what you find in other buildings. So first of all, there's a couple of tanks up here that are part of our solar hot water system. So this provides preheated water to the domestic water system, and we have a combined domestic hot water and hot water radiant floor heat system. So anyway, the solar panels are helping us eliminate use of gas. Now we have 2 small boilers over here that modulate back and forth depending on the load, but they're really quite small. In terms of things that we did to preserve the character of the building, we left the board form concrete walls exposed. Obviously the columns and beams are exposed. This wall is a party wall, so there's no heat loss here. The wall where the window is mostly underground. So we just took advantage of those opportunities where we didn't have to add insulation. We worked with our energy model to get us to a place that we could achieve the LEED energy savings requirements or exceed them without having to cover everything up. This was our 12th LEED Platinum building. It's also was our second LEED Platinum Historic Tax Credit certified building. So although those 2 programs don't always play nice together, and they certainly are not coordinated with each other in any conceivable way. We were able to accomplish both within this building, and to great benefit. The tax credits were worth about roughly 25% of the state and federal credits of our total project cost. And in this case, we used those credits to repay the other two partners, my other two partners. Well, actually, all three of us got some of the tax credits, but they were the larger money investors, and the credits essentially offset their initial investment. We finished the building in the fall of 2012, and we were advertising that we had apartments coming for rent. The downtown loft housing market was relatively newer at that time, not brand new, but tremendous demand. So at the point that we opened the building, we had a waiting list of 51 for 19 units. So it did not take very long to lease up. In fact, there was so much demand that we had to make arrangements with the city to finish it floor by floor so that we could move people in, even though it was only by about a week or a couple of weeks in each case, on each level, rather than hold the whole building up until the end. So yeah, a lot of, and that in spite of the fact that there's no downtown parking, that was just not an issue. And over time, it became really a non-issue. Pay attention to all three of those factors at all times in order to achieve our three goals: tax credits, LEED Platinum, cool, all under a budget. And we did basically hit our budget. We had enough contingency to deal with most of, really, I guess all of, the rotten floor that we discovered. So we have learned by doing this a lot that it doesn't cost more to do a LEED Platinum building. It will save you a ton of money in the long run. And we've learned that because the LEED for us is not frosting on the cake, it's just part of the cake. It's built into how we think about everything and how we do things, so that ultimately it's not a premium and it's not some big compromise. We just think like that, we work like that, we make it happen. And it's still, LEED Platinum is not a piece of cake. I mean, you've got to work hard to get there, but we can do it without blowing up our budget or having to make some kind of compromises that we're really not interested in making. And we don't buy points. We don't need to.
Thanks, everybody, for watching our case studies. And as you can see, we found an incredible variety of projects going on around the country. And we tried to select things that showed entirely different kind of code issues that are coming up, from the smallest scale rural areas with, what's the basic use of a building and how to, work from a construction-based owner, worker, doer, the small bakery cafe, to a fully complex LEED certified sustainability, energy conservation, historic preservation project that shows kind of all of the bells and whistles of what we're doing today in sustainability and seeing how these work. So a great range of projects across the country and different code issues. I'd like to start in order with each of the projects and get the person who kind of conveyed their story, in this case, Tim, on the first one. The bakery seems to bring up the most basic issue of what's the use of a building. How did this so happen that a small little bakery became a factory?
I think, thanks, Mike. I think the main item there was that the building official really had nothing other than the title of the business was a bakery. They actually had very little baking to do other than some breads once in a while. And there was no other information that they had. So they already started a project. The building official had very little to work with, and we basically started by going back through Sanborn maps and looking at tax records to see who was in the space before the bakery was there. So that's how it all got started. And then, working with the building official who really just didn't want to deal with the situation at all and try to help them through that, along with an owner that wasn't really excited about getting a permit.
I mean, obviously, one of the messages we've heard throughout this is work with your building official early, establish that relationship. They're going to cooperate, and so that message rings through loud and clear. Don't start construction without a permit. But I still got a sense that just the title bakery triggered somebody to think factory, and maybe it seems so innocent that the little business owner said, well, this will be called a bakery, and didn't realize that that could have an implication to the use classification in the building code.
That's a scale problem also, because the code under the occupancy doesn't distinguish whether you are baking 6 trays of cookies a day with a countertop unit versus a full production bakery, and the risks associated with each of those is pretty different.
Yeah, the building official really sunk into that, and I think the conversation kind of came around to looking at any cafe, any restaurant, and the volume that they're doing, even for a small B occupancy that doesn't even trigger the A occupancy for larger restaurants. They weren't doing enough quantity or even holding enough material on site to really matter. But we had to go through all those tables. And even after that, until we actually started looking at sort of these alternate compliance methods and pathways, we just weren't getting anywhere. And, that's sometimes where I think building officials can really dig in, and it just took some time, but we got there. But it took looking at other things that are being done that aren't being classified as that.
Yeah, and I think we heard from Chris the other day that a retail establishment that all of a sudden started selling upholstered furniture moved it to a different classification of hazard of materials. So the whole idea of how we establish a use seems very cut and dried when it's residential. It's 1 and 2 units or it's more. But when you get into all these business occupancies, there can be a lot of gray areas that are based on what's put inside the building, particularly at stores that are selling flammable materials versus an office with presumably just paper.
Be great to hear from our code officials attending on this topic, because occupancy, that's a challenge. And I don't know when those classifications were established, but it's a long time ago and way before some of the common uses now were even conceived of. And so we're still stuck with that interaction with the construction.
Well, to be totally fair to everybody involved in the project, the building officials, they're hired on contract for a town of, at that time, less than 400, who rarely had permits pulled to begin with. They were just sort of turning that corner where they actually were trying to enforce things. And so there's also these really negative feelings about enforcement because it was just a whole new day with building codes. So there's so much going on with this project over when it comes down to it, and any other jurisdiction would have been a very simple permit for a tenant finish. But it did trigger a much larger community conversation, which is good. And I think too, the economic development side of things really came into play, where the city realized that if they didn't get a building code that everybody wanted to use and could use, they were going to have a hard time attracting development in that town.
Moving to Joe in Wisconsin, the combination of buildings is very common in our main streets. As owners kind of expand their business, they buy the building next door, they connect. Yours is very unusual in that it was combined a long time ago, enough that you had what looked like 2 buildings was really 1 building, but that made a big difference. But the thing that I sort of wonder about in yours is that it was a very small amount of action. What were the real code issues? Were the triggers? Was it just getting a small, controversial, or difficult?
I think, well, I guess to answer your question, it was it was a property owner that had never tackled anything like this before. And the biggest thing that really had us contact Jennifer was the fact that it was a one-story building next to a two-story building that was combined into one parcel. There was a huge opening between the what used to be the party wall between the two buildings. And there was also another building that was built after a fire. It was a new building that was built next door, and there was an atrium next door. And when we first saw the plans, it looked like there were two windows that opened into that atrium area. And so there were enough issues where I thought that this is beyond me. You know, I'm not a registered architect, so we had some money available, and that's kind of why we brought Jennifer in. And then in the end, what happened was, because they were only renovating 21% of it, a lot of it, you know, I probably wouldn't have needed the code review, but I think it was really good exercise for that property owner. It was really good exercise for us to see. And I think the reason I chose this as an example is because of all those things with the combined parcel, and where if they weren't combined parcels, you know, they wouldn't have been able to open up those other windows. They may not have been able to have bedrooms on that sidewall. You know, it could have been really bad, but it ended up not being as bad because of the parcel issue and because of the limited scope of work that was being done.
Nick, I'm seeing a lot of questions come up here in the chat about the whole issue of dealing with a vacant building and a reuse, and what's the prior use classification of vacant, and how is that worked into the story? You want to give us a little more background on how that worked with you, with your, particularly the hotel project?
Sure. Well, I think you've probably said this many times, that vacant is not a building occupancy classification. And the building codes are currently mum on, you know, how long does something have to be vacant before you can't consider it as an existing use. And for the Hamlet Hotel in particular, that was actually a really strong consideration, that it had been used as, you know, a residential occupancy of some kind in the past. And so the building code official definitely considered that, because of the way it was laid out, the features that were still extant, you know, as the result of that were considered. And ultimately, it was basically just considered to be an improvement to an existing use, you know, even though it had been vacant for quite some time prior to the rehab starting. And so I think there's that level of pragmatism that really is important for building code officials and architects to understand mutually, that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. And there are definitely existing conditions that you can identify and take advantage of that give you at least a framework, so that you're not building a new building from scratch. And that's not what we're doing. We're not building totally new buildings within the envelope of an existing building. That's not how rehabs work. That's not how they should work.
Joe, the chat is having people talk about zoning ordinance says if it's vacant for so long, you need a zoning permit. How does that play into the building permit process? Should it?
Well, I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but I think what I see in a lot of communities are property owners that don't realize that there's a difference in code review. And so they think that, well, if they get approval for their zoning ordinance, they can do whatever they want, you know. And it really takes a lot of education, repeated education in a lot of communities to educate them on that difference.
And I also get a sense that the zoning ordinance does have the vacancy clause in there, that if something's vacant for so long, you then have to reapply to see if the zoning is allowed. But that is very separate from the building code. And the term of art within the building code community is the last known legal use. You know, so if it's been vacant for 50 years, but the last known legal occupancy, and since then it's just been an empty building, that's not storage or warehouse use, but just empty, then it would go back to default to the 50 years ago, the last known legal use as residential. And what that is, but that's where we get into using city directories, Sanborn maps, and other tools of our trade to get to there.
So Mike, we're committed to publishing the case studies, these and the earlier ones, and I forgot yesterday, the day before, whenever we saw them. But the other item that all of us have spoken for a while is to find and make available the language that we think that could be locally adopted or will be useful in any sorts of ways. As we stumble across it or as we become aware of it, and then make it available to other folks in their communities. And you spoke, I guess, 2 days ago about what's in the California state, the Historic Building Code for California. And that's probably an easy one for us to put up because it's already been vetted and well written. And that is the type of information that we need to share, so that folks who get engaged in the process can bring that forward and make sure that becomes a local amendment. Where some of the items that John Curley spoke of earlier on is be sure that any other local amendments that of quality of life or other purposes don't also address your existing buildings, or watch out for what you receive if you get the fire code and those retroactive provisions. So some of that will be really starting to focus on, and some became very clear, I think, in these 3 days. And we'll put those on our website.
I've always thought that there should be a committee of unexpected consequences for every decision that's made.
Nick, one of the things that you brought up in your case study, and it also came up with Randy, is with the use of sprinklers in a building, you were able to use bedrooms that if you have sprinklers, you could have a bedroom without exterior windows, either as rescue windows or as natural light and air. So this is a benefit. How did that work out? And I also saw that you had residential 13R sprinklers. Want to talk more about that decision?
Sure. Sprinklers are always your friend in terms of, trying to meet building code issues, right? Because they solve a lot more problems. And I know there's a huge hurdle economically when trying to retrofit. But sprinklers aren't the only hurdle that people have to get over when it comes to trying to economically and feasibly build housing into an existing space. So I'll just leave it at that. We definitely understand the economic hurdles for trying to fit a new sprinkler system. But I will say that there's 2 types of sprinkler systems that the code allows for, depending on different situations and all the facts and circumstances. One being NFPA 13R, which allows protection for occupants to be able to get out of the building, but it doesn't protect the building itself from continuing to burn. And NFPA 13 sprinkler system, which allows for the structure to hopefully not have to suffer catastrophic damage as a result of the fire, as well as getting people out. So there's 2 different levels that are allowed. And ultimately, if your number one objective is to make sure that occupants can get out, then the 13R is the absolute minimum that you could do if you're trying to absolve that issue. But we see this a lot with seismic retrofits as well, where there's different levels of life safety that you can inject into a retrofit that will minimally protect life and people for being able to exit the building safely without being harmed. But then there's that extra level of, what damage will the building permanently suffer? So it, again, kind of turns into a long-term economic issue as well, where you're cutting your losses up front by reducing your upfront capital expense by putting in a 13R sprinkler system might cost less initially. But if you do have a fire, the people are safe, but you might have long-term economic consequences by having to rebuild more because you didn't have that added layer, with that higher level sprinkler system. So it's kind of a decision, hopefully nothing will happen, obviously, but do you want to spend money now or do you want to spend money later?
I think the big key takeaway for me was that the use of that allowed the ability to create habitable bedrooms that were deep in a long building. And Randy talked about that in his property as well. And he went back to the 2009 changes in the IEBC. So this is where the addition of sprinklers could be helpful when you've got long, deep buildings without good natural light and air and long bedrooms. And that's a pretty consistent formula I've seen for these skinny, long, deep buildings that are hard. I also saw that they cut front balconies where they put the wall of the building back from the base of the building, the unit, to kind of make an exterior balcony, which is another technique for these long, skinny buildings. Very clever. Marilyn, we are kind of running out of questions from the chat, but I see a lot of people are chatting with each other, which is great. You're using this forum to discover who can do things and share the knowledge, which is what we wanted to happen. I'd like to invite Marilyn to do a little wrap up on some of the bigger issues that we've been seeing in our code workshop today. Marilyn?
Well, first, a big thank you to all who participated as presenters, our support team, and participants who have borne through the challenges. And Mike, a special thanks to you and the other members of the Main Street Task Group who are on the screen. We've just heard of Chris Root and Leslie Gilmore, who has shown us her Excel and math skills with our performance-based prototype. And Kristen and Adam and Elizabeth at White Cloud, who've kept us going and also listened to 3 days of code talk. So the entire 3 days has been a first in many ways. It's a first that I know of, dedicated workshop to codes and Main Street buildings. Imagine 15 hours of that. And it's also a first to bring together such a diverse audience at some scale, more than 400 folks, code officials, Main Streeters, architects, engineers, planners. Over the days, I've learned a lot about buffering and platforms. And again, we are all very apologetic for the technical glitches and we'll make the participants whole. We learned about fire tests and codings and calculations and challenges and opportunities in local politics and how much there is to do to work with our colleagues from the energy, fire protection engineering, and the manufacturing worlds. And through the chat, we learned about many of your issues and priorities. Probably most important is the team, which is all of us. And so much is about our openness and our attitudes and communications and becoming educating and sharing our education with others, especially including those who are responsible for adopting the legislation that we work under. And I hope that through the post-workshop survey, you'll tell us what worked for you, what else is important, and how to make this type of presentation even more useful. You don't have to say very much about the technology glitches. We got that one down. So on behalf of both of us, Mike and I, as the co-chairs of the APT Technical Committee, we hope you'll join us and the committee. Please reach out to us. One of our current efforts over 2022 has been in code development, and we are actively engaged in improving how the codes, in particular the existing building code, addresses existing and historic buildings. It's a challenging process. You need a long view, and probably it's never been more complicated for existing buildings because we're also responding to expectations related to climate change and energy performance and housing shortages. I believe that our smaller Main Street buildings that we've spent these days talking about are opportunities that have been hiding in plain sight, and they're centrally located. They're development ready, and they're absolutely community anchors. So I hope you'll join us in these efforts, and you can find us. Our emails will go back up at the end of this session, and/or just please contact us through APT. So a big thank you to all for making this a success.
And I'd like to second that with the issue of what comes next. Our APT Codes and Standards Technical Committee welcomes new members, and we've spotted more than a few of you this workshop, people commenting, ready to share your expertise. Membership organization, that's part of how we do this. We work through a lot of technical committees and our technical committee can all use more. About 2 years ago, I had a meeting with the Main Street architects, and Joe Lonizak said, you know, this code issue is really becoming bigger and bigger issue. What should we do about it? I invited him to join our APT team. We spent about 6 months talking about the issues. And out of that, we said, well, how are we going to help everybody? And out of that came this workshop. We applied to HPEF, the Historic Preservation Education Foundation. They were our original seed funding for providing speakers to do this. And with that and the APT organizational skills and our other partners, we were able to put together this content. But it took us about a year to do it. The thing that I'm most excited about and seeing moving forward is developing the tool, the performance method tool, the Excel spreadsheet that Leslie has helped develop. We're committed to sharing that and getting that out there. Please give us a little time. We're going to get the bugs worked out on it, get the explanation, get the information so that we can offer this through the APT platform. That would be the website for the Codes Committee, but also other ways in which the Codes Committee and APT work. So Marilyn and I have been on the road. We consistently present on this topic. We will be at the National Trust Conference virtual workshop in November. I was at the National Association of Preservation Commissions conference last month, and we continue to try and integrate in the historic preservation world. With this workshop, we expanded to the Main Street world and the larger world of empty buildings. You know, there's a lot of opportunities out there, and that's really where we're at. We want to see things put back into use and use the tools and help everyone recognize that the code official is an incredible, important person on your team. You've heard, don't start without a permit. The stories from small town America. Well, in our case, start as you as a Main Street manager. When was the last time you had lunch with your building code official? Not because there was a problem or a project, but to open the dialogue. And that's really what it's all about. Connecting with people and skills. We have the technical side of that. You as Main Street managers know about your community. We know this is a compelling issue for Main Streets across the country. And therefore, we're really proud of APT having put this information together. So with that said, keep your comments coming. Join APT, follow us on your web links. But thank you all for making this conference such a success.